Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we go to Ukraine, where we are joined by Yuliya Yurchenko. Yuliya Yurchenko is a senior lecturer in political economy at the University of Greenwich in the United Kingdom, and she is the author of the book Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, From Marketisation to Armed Conflict. She joins me over Zoom. Yuliya Yurchenko, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this program. Thank you for taking this time to join me.
Thank you very much for contacting me. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I wish we were doing this under better circumstances, let's put it this way. But I'm also glad that I'm in a place that's calm relatively enough for us to be able to have this conversation, and that connection is, fingers crossed, stable enough for us to be able to do it, because it means a lot for a scholar of Ukraine. It means a lot to me as a Ukrainian that there is interest and there is attention, and that programs like yours, people like you, and there are so many journalists and scholars and socially active citizens who are trying to gather as many stories and voices and trying to understand what actually is happening, not least because there is so much misinformation, there is so much fake reportage that it really is important to get to the crux of the matter and talk to people who have been dealing with these issues in a kind of more in-depth way.
When you say there's fake reportage, what are you, or is there anything particular you're referring to?
Well, there is a lot coming out of Kremlin, of course, and you probably have come across some of those. There's some like doctored videos that come out of FSB and some Russian news outlets, a reportage about how Russia is winning the war and how Ukraine is shelling civilians, for example. There is that kind of stuff. There is a lot of there is a lot of infiltrations of various Telegram channels, for example, and we see that. I'm signed up to a bunch of local journalists and politicians and ministries because they a lot of them use Telegram channels, and they would make certain announcements and they say about certain people being killed or certain planes being down, and then a little while they go, well, that information has been proven to have been incorrect. So there is a lot of cyber warfare going on in the background, where there is a lot of there is a lot of information that floats around that may not necessarily be accurate. So it's a very difficult terrain to navigate for anybody who is trying to make sense of what is going on in the country. And you need to check and triple check any piece of evidence that comes your way.
I do want to. I didn't plan on starting here, and we'll get into more what's happening where you are and in the conditions of Ukraine in general. I didn't plan to start here, but since we started on the media coverage, I'd like to follow up there, only because we've never talked before. But in preparing for our conversation, I assumed you're very critical of neoliberal policies in Ukraine and Russia, and you take a historical look. I suspect we could say you're on the political left, as this radio station is. I suspect you're following the discourse about what's happening right now on the left in the United Kingdom, where you're also a citizen, which maybe is similar to the leftist discourse in the United States. And in the United States, there are some debates among, not everyone on the left, but some on the left, about what's happening, and what maybe even bigger debates about what's driving Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Everything from Ukraine collaborating and working with Nazis in Ukraine, to the 2014 protests that occurred, calling that a coup. How do you see the debate that's occurring right now on the left? And if I mischaracterized you about being on the left, you let me know.
No, you haven't. I think there are no secrets about that. I am quite firmly on the left, and I like to think that I've done my homework. I've been growing up. As I've done my homework before I've committed myself. I didn't grow up in an environment that was most conducive for people to become very left-wing. I was born in 82. By the time I was in early years of school years, as I was falling apart, and there was a whole narrative of the end of history. Well, I've learned about that a bit later, but the sense was that, communism is over and now we're going to build the market and the rest of it. And I have seen what the market has done to the country. I have seen what it has done, to career prospects and expectations of a better life to people like me. I have seen the widespread anomie in the society. I have seen explosion of what what's called in bourgeois narrative the juvenile delinquency. And it's just this disenfranchisement of generation after generation. I've seen the social inequalities explode before my eyes, and I've seen what it does to people's consciousness and their behavior. There were some people, my friends of my parents, and parents of my friends at school, who I thought were really decent people, and then with a bit of money appearing in their pocket, they would turn into some very unpleasant individuals. And that kind of thing stays with you. And I didn't quite have the language to articulate it. And then some years later, wanting to be an interpreter, I came to Sussex University to do a master's in international relations. And I read a bit more on Gramsci and Marx, and everything fell into place. I finally had the language to explain what I was witnessing and what was bothering me. So yeah, I'm very firmly there. I was just kind of looking for my language for a while. And in terms of these narratives on the left, I find some of it, a lot of it is relevant, but the way, like the things that you mentioned about the fact that there are groups that are not holding any secrets about affiliating themselves with neo-Nazi discourses, and they wear some insignia. They do exist in Ukraine. That is true. We should be honest about it. We should be honest about the fact that the transfer of power in 2014 was a little problematic. Technically, a lot of the constitutional procedures have been followed, but at the same time, there were lots of problems. So we need to be honestly talking about that. At the same time, the frustration that I find is that it's one thing to say that there were forces during these Maidan protests in 2013 and 14 who clearly have been right-wing, and they are still, those who are around. They have been violent to some of the left-wing protesters in the Maidan and the women's organizations. And when the violence broke out in Kiev and in other cities, the right-wing forces have been largely responsible for mobilizing the protests to protect themselves against the police and the so-called anti-Maidan protests. So not least because they are the ones who always train in kind of some sort of semi-military ways. So they were the ones who were ready for this kind of mobilization. The rest of people who joined this sort of semi-spontaneous protest didn't quite know how to respond and what to do. They were quite disorientated. And so the right-wing forces sort of hijacked, in a sense, this, the public outrage and the masses that were in the streets, but they didn't, which didn't have a sense of direction or ideological coherence or a program or a mission. They just joined the protests, and most of them joined those protests not necessarily to get rid of Yanukovych, or because they wanted to be part of the EU, because we know why they joined the protest, because we have the surveys. The majority of people joined those Maidan protests after the police beat up peaceful protesters in the middle of the night at the end of November 2013. So that's when it turned from being a protest of people who were annoyed about Yanukovych not signing the EU association agreement into something that was much more. It was frustration. People spilled into the streets because they were frustrated after years of lawlessness, corruption, embezzlement, dispossession, and the general kind of lack of hope, the hope that was taken away from them by the actions of Yanukovych. So that is something that needs to be remembered. Whether it was a right-wing coup or not, I've heard that story a number of times, and I wouldn't call it that, and I do not call it that in my work. I agree that there were some right-wing elements that have hijacked the achievements of this sort of the protest in the streets, and they have been quite pivotal in some points. But they didn't take over the state power. They did take some important positions. There were a couple in the interim government, and some of them have penetrated the defense forces. But to say that they somehow have taken over the control of the country is also untrue. The situation was unraveling very fast. Putin, there is a lot to kind of squeeze in, but roughly, Putin annexes the Crimea, Yanukovych flees, Putin annexes the Crimea, not least under the pretense that Kiev doesn't have legitimate government. There is no commander-in-chief. Ukraine cannot start using its army without a legitimate commander-in-chief. Should Ukraine have started using its military forces through the interim government, A, it's anti-constitutional, B, Putin would have interpreted it as an excuse to full-on go into the country and even further go on with painting Ukraine as this kind of fascist-run state that doesn't have a legitimate government, right? So, and that kind of conjuncture has been used by the oligarchs who were rejected by people in the streets to say that we need to have an election right now, and we need to have somebody with experience. We need to have them right now so that we have a commander-in-chief and we can protect these eastern, southern regions unrest and potential separatist republics from becoming separatist republics. And that's how Poroshenko and the oligarchic regime managed to survive. So we need to look into the details of how the events developed. Oligarchs have survived by capitalizing on this fast unraveling situation. By actually Putin invading Ukraine in 2014 has allowed oligarchs to stay in power. Maybe Ukraine would have become a fascist state. I don't know. I don't think it would, because but the thing is that oligarchs stayed in power, and they have tried to assimilate and instrumentalize for their own remaining in power some of those right-wing elements, because the majority of population have rejected the right-wing groups. There was the parliamentary election in 2014 when it banned in the middle of a military campaign, and not one right-wing party managed to get enough seats in the parliament. Not one of them managed to get more than 5% to get into the parliament. Right-wing parties in Germany get more seats in peaceful time. So we need to also have that kind of context, that even when there was this so-called, what some of the leftists paint as, this kind of fascist coup, and there was a military campaign of Russia against Ukraine through these proxy so-called self-proclaimed republics. And a lot of this campaign was launched on the pretext that fascists are launching an onslaught on Russian-speaking population, and Ukraine is not even a nation. Its identity doesn't exist. So Ukrainian people had every reason to reinstate, not so much reinstate, but assert and stress that we are a nation and we have a language and we have a culture, in a response to the denial of that from Russia. And in that context, still, only marginal amount of people wanted that kind of the right-wing narrative being represented in the parliament. That needs to be understood, that yes, those sort of forces exist. To say they are unimportant and that they do not have any impact on shaping the kind of the mainstream discourse in the country, we can't say that they don't. They do, but to say that the majority of population are turning into fascist and it's a fascist-run state, that's just simply, that just doesn't hold. That doesn't hold, that theory, and I find it quite frustrating with a lot on the left. There are a lot of comparisons being made with God knows how old narratives from the Russian Revolution, certain social forces and this and that. And what I find in those analyses is that it's almost as if they're a bit lazy. They're supposed to be historical materialists, but then there is no will to study any social forces on the ground beyond some of the right-wing forces. And you need to look deeper, and you need to kind of understand the context in which these forces have even got a seat at the table, and also the degree to which what they push as agenda impacts what's going on in the country. That needs to be understood. And the country is under attack. It's being told now more than ever by Putin's Russian ideologues, that it's not even a country, it doesn't have a right to exist. It's never been anything in its own right. And in that kind of context, you are pushed to try to start talking about the history of your language, start pulling out some sort of nation building narratives. So that needs to be understood. It shouldn't be allowed to get out of proportion, but that needs to be understood.
You teach political economy again in the United Kingdom. You are also a citizen of the United Kingdom. You're now I believe where you're from with your family in Ukraine during this period of time. You have been very critical of Ukraine and its governance system. You've called it a kleptocracy, which means its rulers steal the country's resources for their own good. But with that criticism that you have for Ukraine, you are staying in Ukraine now in order to help, am I correct, help oppose the invasion of Russia?
Yes, absolutely, because sorry, I didn't interrupt your question, did I? Yes, because I stand with average Ukrainians, and I take a class level of analysis. So while we can talk about the dominant forces in Ukraine, the ruling class, and the ruling regime as being something that can be described as neoliberal kleptocracies, a combination of kleptocracy and neoliberal policies being used to further the kind of kleptocratic wants and needs of various oligarchic groups. We also can at the same time talk about the average Ukraine's labor, the dispossession of them, the phases through which oligarchic empires, their own financial industrial groups, these massive enterprises have been built through privatization and state asset embezzlement. So a lot of, when USSR fell apart and Ukraine became an independent country, all of its property was state property, right? There was some form of private property in the countryside. People could have their houses and this and that and the other, but the rest of it was collectively, most of the property was collectively owned by the state on behalf of the citizens. And then since 1992, with the first tranche of IMF loans, privatization process starts in the country as one of the conditions. We need to go to market economy and such. And in that process of splitting the state resources and assigning them commercial value and assigning that value to what was called vouchers. There was voucher privatizations. People were given a form of, like those vouchers, there was sort of like a form of a share of enterprises where people worked. And similar stuff happened with collectively owned land. So a lot of people were assigned allotments of roughly 600 square meters, as in kind of division of state property. Now it's your private property. And of course, most people didn't hold on to that. Some didn't even know what to do with it because the institution of private property didn't quite exist for a very long time. So, but those who were in charge of enterprises, so-called red directors, for example, or old nomenclatura members, they knew very well what to do with those things because they were running enterprises and sectors. So they started buying on cheap these vouchers and concentrating ownership of various assets in their hands, also giving preferential access to their mates when different enterprises were being privatized, for example. And so in that process, through up until in the first 10 years of Ukraine's independence, but by the end of the 90s, it was already very clear that there were massive social inequalities. There were those who came out victors of privatization, and there were those who ended up being dispossessed. Add to that the lack of funding and disruption of provision of public services and the funding of healthcare and education. So you have this kind of double squeeze on households, and a lot of services that people used to get for free, such as, again, education or healthcare, people start having to pay out of their own pockets. So you have this proletariarization of an everyday Ukrainian. And they are the people with who I stand now. There are millions of Ukrainians, like now there is almost 2 million of Ukrainians who are registered as refugee in the last 2 weeks. But before that, there was an even bigger number of Ukrainians working in Europe, and many in Russia, but more so in Europe, as in the EU Europe. seeking better fortune because of joblessness in Ukraine. People are not fleeing the country because they do not want to be here, but rather because they are trying to make the ends meet. And Ukrainian economy relies alone on a lot on remittances. So, yes, I'm standing here with those people. I'm fighting for a country where people do not have to leave if they do not want to. I'm fighting not just against Putin, but against imperialism. And it is imperialistic aggression of Putin into Ukraine right now. And I'm fighting as part of a progressive new left organization, trying to register themselves as a political party called Social Movement, whose position is anti-imperialist, it's anti-oligarch. They want to build a better Ukraine for the workers. We work a lot with trade unions. We work a lot with disenfranchised people, with migrant workers, with displaced people, and it's them for who I fight. It's the average farmers who are trying to make to build a better life for themselves, who are trying to work the land. They know what hard labor is, and now their livelihood is being destroyed. Their houses that they worked so hard to kind of keep in decent order over the years are now being bombed. Their fields are being destroyed. It's them for who I'm fighting here. And once the imperialistic aggression of Russia is out, oligarchs in Ukraine must go. There was Ukrainian government has announced that they're going to nationalize Russian-owned enterprises in Ukraine, and I'm really glad about that for many reasons. One of the reasons is that I'm in the middle of a project trying to assess the level of penetration of Ukrainian economy by Russian capital. And the Ukrainian government will just make a list for me, which is great. It's going to save me a lot of time. But at the same time, it should, how I see that this process shouldn't stop with Russian enterprises, that oligarchic enterprises in Ukraine should be passed into the control and ownership of its workers. And that must happen because there is imperialistic aggression of Russia. There is crippling conditionality of IMF and other foreign debt givers to Ukraine. And of course, you know about structural adjustment programs. But also there is local oligarchs who have been embezzling money that not least came through loans with interest, that have been avoiding and evading paying taxes. System Capital Management, the biggest financial industrial group in Ukraine, ownership of Rinat Akhmetov, the biggest oligarch, who owns the biggest and most expensive penthouse in London. His company, 97% is registered in Cyprus. And Cyprus on the country balance books looks like one of the biggest investors in Ukraine. It's not the Cyprus, it's the recycled cash. So oligarchs trying to avoid taxes, but also partly invest in their own enterprises, rinse money through offshore zones. I know when there were these narratives in the West around sanctions against Ukraine, against Russian oligarchs, we saw how much toothlessness was around it. Like, how do you do them? Do you do them targeted at persons or certain companies? What do you do? And the thing is that, of course, nothing meaningful and nothing serious can be done about global oligarchy, because London oligarchs are benefiting from the system as well as Russian oligarchs are doing, as American oligarchs are doing, as Ukrainian oligarchs are doing. Ukrainian oligarchs didn't invent offshore. They didn't invent transfer pricing. They simply took advantage of it. They were not stupid people. They knew what they were doing. They go, oh, okay, so these are the ways through which we can steal from the country. And so when I'm fighting against them here, I'm fighting against that in the UK as well, because the fight against imperialism of capitalism and global oligarchy, global capitalists who are exploiting labor globally, it's everywhere. And so wherever this kind of imperialistic aggression, I think it's a task of everybody who considers themselves on the left to join in whichever way they can, because it's a war of global capital against global labor. And that's why I'm here.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Yuliya Yurchenko, who joins us from Ukraine. Yuliya Yurchenko is a senior lecturer on political economy at the University of Greenwich in the United Kingdom. She is also the author of the book, Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, from Marketisation to Armed Conflict. So it sounds like, first, defend Ukraine from the Russian invasion. Afterwards, turn your attention back on the government of Ukraine.
Yes, absolutely. And also, not just the government of Ukraine, but other capitalist imperialist exploitations that exist in the country. So, for example, right now, already through the social movement organization that I'm part of, that was founded on the 1st of May 2015, and I was there. It was a beautiful day. And through the Another Europe is Possible initiative, we've launched we've launched a number of campaigns and petitions to lobby the European, to lobby the EU governments, the European Commission, European Central Bank, and IMF to cancel Ukraine's foreign debt. That Ukraine is the second largest debtor. Last time I checked, maybe it's changed in the last 2 weeks, with IMF. And and by now, not least thanks to that, and thanks to Russian aggression, 8 years of it, and the financial crisis of 2008, the country is the poorest country in Europe. And we have to understand that in 1991, it had the economy size of France. This is the level of de-development that happened due to marketization and kleptocracy in the country. So on the one hand, we see some sort of GDP growth, and a year on year, it looks all right. If you look on balance, the country has been very seriously de-developed. I work on that kind of narrative in my academic work, that we shouldn't be talking about transition to market. We should be talking about de-development of already developed countries by market forces and by transition to market, not least because of underfunding of public services and erosion of social reproduction infrastructure. And we see that in Ukraine, there are some very painful expressions of that. For example, a lot of women are pushed into prostitution and surrogacy. And it's not because they love sex work so much. It's because that's how they can survive and pay their bills. You know, maybe some do, maybe for some it is a choice, but for most, well, you know, choice is never a neutral category, really. Yeah, so that is something that is very important to do. So cancellation of the external debt, of the foreign debt, which is crippling the economy, that needs to happen. De-oligarchization must happen. And the narrative that I'm pushing is that it should be done through transfer of ownership and management of those enterprises to their workers, because those enterprises were taken from the workers in the first place. It could be done on a form of collective ownership by the workers. Excellent. And there are examples of that in other European countries, so we can kind of tap into those. And there are also certain conditionalities in the deep comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, which stipulate that market-based solutions and competition must be prioritized in all sectors. And that is something that needs to be removed. Because it's also found in treaties of the European Union that European Commission must remain neutral on the form of ownership of at least public enterprises. They should remain neutral. But then there is a contradiction in that same framework, where market way of operating things should be prioritized. Well, you can't have it two ways. Right? You can't be neutral and then say prioritize this. So that condition needs to be removed. For Ukraine to be able to rebuild itself, it needs to build resilient foundational economy, and also rebuild its enterprises and infrastructure that have been destroyed. There is a lot of popularity for post-Keynesian investment types and accelerators and multipliers in the US and in the EU as well. And I think on that, Ukraine can really build and try to sort of get some sort of negotiating ground with its Western partners, because as much as I would love to see, a communist revolution around the world, it's not going to happen tomorrow. But there are avenues. So I'm thinking now with my colleagues and comrades here, what kind of avenues within the existing frameworks and within the current context as well exist in order to get some sort of breathing space for Ukrainian workers so that they can rebuild the economy and run it on their own terms. And I think that there is some space in there. I'm not holding my breath. I'm not naive. I know it's not going to be very easy. But those are some of the initiatives that we're trying to develop and kind of really develop the programs in which we're going to try to negotiate through trade union movements, through social movements, the dialogue with our Western partners, so that they create some sort of room for maneuver for Ukrainian economy to try and rebuild. And on top of that, we advocate for large-scale macroeconomic and financial aid, because it's not loans, but specifically aid. Because what is happening in Ukraine is partly to do not only with NATO, NATO I'll mention later, but also with the international community of states, for the lack of a better phrase, inability to respond adequately in 2014 to Russian aggression. This war could have been prevented. And so what Ukraine is going to need once this hell is over, and I hope it's over soon, is aid in a form of reparations, because Ukraine is now fighting the war on behalf of a lot of other countries, and it needs to be supported in that. And I think you mentioned NATO earlier as well. Like, I sympathize partly with the narrative on the left about how NATO really didn't have any business spreading on the East. I do think that what Putin does with that whole narrative that, it was promised to Russia, that there wasn't, 1 inch spread to the East. Well, I've studied that well enough, and it was referring to East Germany, and it was a verbal promise to a president of the country that doesn't exist. So he could really get over it, but we knew that he wouldn't. And at the same time, it doesn't give, well, I do not justify the spread of NATO. I think they should have dissolved in 1991, at least, if not sooner. But it's still, none of that justifies Russian aggression toward Ukraine. You have a problem with NATO, deal with NATO. You do not start invading Ukraine. This is simply not acceptable. But I do think that NATO did play a role in here, not to justify Russia, but we have to be able to talk about both of those things. That NATO is not a club of kittens, and they have done atrocious things globally. And United States have spat in the face of the United Nations Security Council enough times for Russia to turn around and go, well, if you break the rules, why can't we? And then the whole world can't do anything. And we need to be able, especially on the left, because I hope that we can have adult conversations, to be dealing with all of those contradictions at the same time and learning from them for our own movement, but also for the sake of being able to envisage new generation of international institutions that prevent these atrocities from happening. For example, the hierarchical structure of the United Nations and having Security Council with veto power members, it was always going to malpractice, isn't it? If it is a democratic institution, make it one country, one vote, and whoever is an aggressor can't vote. Don't give veto votes, and also have some sort of punitive procedure for those who violate the rules. But I'm not naive enough to think that it's too easy to accomplish. But a lot of learning for progressive forces, I think, can happen here.
I think that's pretty profound. We have to learn how to deal with the contradictions that are real.
And we're not always too good at dealing with contradictions and accepting that we may have been wrong at some point. And I think we need to grow up collectively. I think there is a lot of will to. I think partly it is, of course, because of the criticism that's being thrown at the left all the time. That there were some historical mistakes, so we have to make sure that we don't make them, so that our opponents cannot criticize us, and that can be quite paralyzing for the movement and for organizations and for solidarities internationally, because politics and geopolitics and economics is always full of contradictions. There will be, and people like Lenin, for example, were quite good at dealing with contradictions, and sometimes took decisions that could have been attributed to a bit of a right of center and a bit too much of a left of center. And sometimes the situation dictates the response, right? And we need to be able to understand that there is a long-term ideological trajectory, and then there are sometimes immediate decisions that need to be made. For example, I'm against wars, and I'm a pacifist, and I do not condone violence in any way. But I do call for international governments to support Ukraine militarily right now, because otherwise it's going to be scorched. So we need to understand that sometimes context dictates certain, like, there is the level of abstraction, and then there is material reality and limited choices. And we need to be able to have conversations about that without thinking that somehow it compromises our position. The level of abstraction and the level of concrete need to be understood as something that's always dialectically related, but is never Puritan. And we need to be able to articulate it in a way that doesn't make our whole narrative fall apart.
Yuliya Yurchenko, in your book, Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, From Marketisation to Armed Conflict, you write this, or this actually might be from an essay that's related to the book. Maybe it's in the book too, but you write this, quote, Ukraine fell victim to the relentless spread of the Empire of Capital, where Russia and Western capitalist geopolitical imperialisms collided. I think you were referring there to the conflict that we saw in the last 8 years in eastern Ukraine. Do you still see that the dynamic today as Russia has taken the war to the whole country?
Oh, absolutely. And it is Ukraine, but it is not just Ukraine. There were other conflicts that have been fought. For example, Syria. It was clearly kind of a clash of various forms of might between United States and Russia, and of course NATO and other forces. But there was that, and there is still that. We still hear this narrative about spheres of interest and how US and NATO should not interfere into what is Russian spheres of interest. But at the same time, we need to remember that Russia is not USSR. And what I feel that some people on the left, and I deliberately am not mentioning any names because I do not want it to become any of that. There will be time when we'll do our own reconciliation committee, but it's not the time right now. But there is this narrative occasionally, and it's as if there is some sort of inability to recognize that Russia is not an ideological counterweight to the United States whatsoever. Not what the USSR was, with its own internal problems and contradictions and Stalinism and the rest of it. But Russia is a KGB-run kleptocracy, and we need to be able to recognize it for that. It can be a geopolitical counterweight and some sort of a next bully on the block to the United States, but it does not offer an alternative vision of the world. It doesn't. They have this Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and the alternative world order vision, which is not much better, if not much worse, than what the international liberal underpinned by capitalism order has. Well, it's not very liberal, as I think you will agree with me, but it's not. Russia is not a counterweight. Russia is not an alternative. And so what we have after the fall of USSR is Russia. Not because Russia was the dominant country within the USSR, it was the dominant republic. It still hasn't gotten over, a lot of people in Russia, not everybody, but a lot of people in Russia haven't gotten over their imperial hangover of Russian Empire being this massive thing and an important player on the international scene. And then USSR was clearly an extremely important player on the international scene. And then all of a sudden, Russia has shrunk to a smaller state. It started losing some of its pivot in the region. It was weakened economically significantly, and the ruble crisis didn't help. And so this kind of sense of wounded inferiority, a lot of it came from this shrink in importance internationally, and that had to be rebuilt. And that's where Putin started getting so much popularity. There was this strong leader who was going to, get Russia important again, and they started competing for imperialist influence and space globally. Whose companies are more important? Who's got the biggest military? Who's got the fastest tanks? Who sells most oil? Whose currency is strongest? Who's got more allies? It was an imperialistic competition. It wasn't a fight of two completely different ideologies and worldviews and world systems. So I do see it colliding like this right now again, because Putin, it's right, it's there in his words. He does not want to except that Ukraine is not part of his sphere of influence. I wouldn't go as far as some more bourgeois-minded commentators would say that, you know, it's a clash of liberal order and some sort of 19th century imperialism. I think that's a little bit too complimentary to how illiberal indeed the international order is, and we have seen that multiple times. Not least, again, as I've already mentioned, how many war crimes were the United States allowed to get away with over the years, and the NATO. So there is this clash, and there is fight for territories, and that needs to be curtailed on all ends, because on the one hand, Putin's regime with its outright fascist Nazi elements, its neglect for any it's disrespect for any nations but Russians, it's disrespect for self-determination of its neighbors, that needs to be stopped. But so should the irregularities and inequalities within the international order. We see, you know, if Ukraine were in Central Asia, we wouldn't nearly see this much international response. It is because by historical coincidence, it's on the so-called border of Europe that everybody is pulling in, mainly so the problem doesn't spill into Europe, as in the Europe, big Europe. So it shouldn't be the positive outcome for the world, for the international labor would not be just Putin being stopped, but it would be also the workers of Russia being emancipated, the people who are petrified, who get thrown for the tiniest protest into jail for stupid amount of years, people who get beaten up for writing no to war in the snow. This is what's happening now, and I applaud the courage of Russians who come into the streets in bigger numbers than in many previous years, knowing what risks they're taking. So that emancipation needs to happen, and also emancipation of the rest of the international labor from the yoke of capitalist imperialism. Because again, capitalism exploits workers internationally. It doesn't differentiate. It doesn't care. U.S. enterprises don't care if they exploit an American worker or a German worker or a Russian worker. They really don't, as long as they can extract more value. And outsourcing of enterprises is one fantastic example of that. Right? What Bezos is doing to the workers in his warehouses in the United States is abominable. And these kind of military conflicts, in geopolitical military conflicts that in which imperialistic ambitions spill into, they are not limited to Ukraine. We've seen them in other places. This is just yet another side, and there will be more until we are done with capitalist imperialistic machine ruling our planet.
You are in the city Vinnytsia. This is southwest of Kyiv, about 100 miles or so, my understanding. You witnessed, I guess, your first missile attack this past weekend? Yeah, well, I've seen some of them fly by as I was fleeing Kiev last Thursday. I'm actually going to pull out the calendar. Like all the days are a bit of a mush. Yes, and it was, when was that? 24th, yeah, 24th. Just as the Russia started, I was in Kiev and I was staying at a friend's flat. And as soon as it was very early in the morning, we just packed our bags. And at 6:30 in the morning, we were trying to leave Kiev, and it took us forever because of the traffic to get out of the city proper. But as we were in the vicinity, as we were driving not far from the Gostomel airport, that's been a constant site of fighting. So we've heard rockets and we've seen some of them fly. So but I was leaving, but I've seen them then already. This one,
yesterday was in a sense more unnerving for me and my family personally, because we were relatively safe here for a while. We would get sirens. There was a couple of smaller towns outside of Vinica that have been shelled before, mainly the ones that had were like fuel warehouses, or there were some ammunition warehouses. So we sort of figured out where these locations are, and we're relatively okay here. And then this airport got bombed, and it's, as I said, like it was in the state of being repaired, like it wasn't even in use, but they're just going after everything. And so as these rockets hit this airport nearby, and you just kind of see them land next to you, you know, despite the fact that we are now quite into this process of being bombed and shelled, and something kind of goes really numb in you, and you start very pragmatically reacting to it. You do not even panic anymore. You just go, okay, do we pack our bags? Do we go? Which route do we take? You're still terrified, but you're kind of in a different headspace. So in that sense, that was really worrying. And I tried to whip my family to move them a bit further west. But at the same time, I don't know, first of all, they don't want to move. I myself do not quite want to move, but my mother is a bit frail and I'm worried about her. But I say she's frail. She says, "Do you know I'm going to die here."
Do you know where you would go?
Well, we thought of, you know, west directions. There is we're not far from the border with Moldova and Romania, and those checkpoints tend to be less busy. So we thought that would be an easier way, just a faster way out. We can also go west proper to the Polish border, and I have a couple of friends who already offered us to stay with them, so that could be possible. So we have a couple of options, and we're in touch with a couple of other friends who have the same attitude, meaning that we are staying here until we realize it's getting quite heated, and then we instantly jump in cars. We're going to organize together, and we're going to drive a couple of cars together. It's a bit safer that way. You know, if something is, God forbid, to happen to one, then the rest will help, and then we'll try to get out together. But the attitude is that we're not going to leave up until we hear proper fighting just here, and we realize that the troops are moving in. And there is a lot of hope that the conflict is dying down. But again, you know, that's what we were saying a week ago, and there is no accurate way of knowing, is there?
There was a third meeting today between Russia and Ukraine. Yeah, and the conditions that Russia puts on the table, they know from the start that they are unacceptable to Ukraine. So now they want the whole of Donbass. So they want the whole of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, not just those bits of occupied territories. They want the whole of Crimea. They want the neutral status for Ukraine, which I honestly do not mind. I don't think that Ukraine should have been flirting with NATO to begin with. But another note is that NATO became popular in Ukraine after Russia annexed the Crimea. Before, there wasn't even there was roughly 40% support for NATO membership. So Ukrainians didn't want to be in NATO. Putin was a convincing argument for that. And there is also one of the conditions, from what I gather, is that they want the government to surrender, and they want to install their own puppet government. And one of the guys that is being speculated to take the place of president is Yuri Boyko, who is part of the Yanukovych family, is one of the kind of old Donetsk oligarchs, which would be unacceptable for the majority of Ukrainians. So that would not be, even if we are to imagine for a second that Ukraine will surrender, which nobody is willing to do, that kind of government would never be accepted. It simply won't hold. Even in Donbass itself, some of these people who are being speculated to take place of leaders, so to speak, do not have the popularity to even last as puppets. Yuliya Yurchenko has been our guest. Again, Yuliya Yurchenko is a senior lecturer in political economy at the University of Greenwich in the United Kingdom. She joins us from the Ukrainian city of Vinnytsia. She is the author of the book, Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, From Marketisation to Armed Conflict. Yuliya Yurchenko, I know this is a crazy time for you right now in your family, and that you gave us so much time to talk to us today is deeply appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking with you. You can call me anytime. I hope I've answered your questions with as much detail as I could. It's a bit difficult to gauge because I, like most Ukrainians, I'm in a strange headspace right now. But I'm glad that we've had this conversation and that we got to meet. And I hope that some of what I've said has explained a little bit more to your listeners about what's going on. And I really hope that this conflict is over as soon as possible. And I can't wait to help my country people rebuild what's been broken.